Good morning, everyone. We're from Central Victoria and Bendigo, Central Victoria, Australia. Well, today we'll obviously talk a little bit about political economy and class struggle. Please beware. I want to keep this to about an hour. Caleb Orpin's going live at 10:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time. That'd be 8:30 Australian Western Standard Time. So I want to keep this as relatively short as possible, and so we can at least enjoy this one, followed by Caleb and whoever else is doing live streams today. Well, first of all, talk a little bit about the political economy. As you're aware, obviously conditions, rates and conditions, wages and conditions here in Australia are certainly going to be on the attack. They are on the agenda now with the federal government. Obviously, there's a lot of legislation being drafted up, what they can do post-COVID-19. In the current situation, there's a big push to get us all back to business as normal. And I only realised the other day the reason why they want us back to business as normal. It's because workers create value. Because otherwise, the capitalists cannot make their profit. And that's, well, just didn't realise. I've known that for some time. But if you want to put it simply, workers create value. And what was interesting during the week, I bought this little magazine, The Economist. It's an American magazine, and obviously there it is. And I wanted to have a look at it to see. Sometimes, if you want to actually know what the capitalist class is up to, sometimes read through some of their material, be it the Australian Financial Review or the Economist. And I just want to read this little paragraph out to you. Hang on, let me get my glasses on. It's very interesting for what they read. And this is what harm do minimum wages do? The concern that minimum wages destroy jobs comes from the most basic of economic models, supply and demand. If labour is made more expensive, employers will probably want less of it. Textbooks state that in the absence of a minimum wage, a worker is paid his marginal product of labour, which means the value of what he produces. There is no room to deviate from this wage in either direction. If an employer tries to pay a worker less, a rival firm will poach him. If the government imposes a minimum wage that is higher than the worker's marginal product, the firm loses money by employing him. He is left jobless instead. And that's coming from a bourgeois economist point of view. But what happens, they don't realise what they're telling you, how Marx was right, that labour creates value. All the wealth that's generated around us, is created by the working class. It's created by labour. And what they're showing there is what Marx described as how profit is made. And I want to put this little simple mathematical equation is A plus B equals C. A represents all the raw resources, your machinery, your factory, your plant, and your material to make the product. B represents labour, you, for obviously the worker who makes the product, equals C, which is the final product. So let's make A 100. Your labour, or the value of your labour, 100, which will give us 200. So that will be the final cost of the commodity. It's an example, like tin tomatoes, for example. Right? You're in a big food factory. Obviously, that's all your fresh tomatoes, your tins or your cans, your factory equipment, production line, etc. Plus the worker who makes the 100 equals 200. Now, where does the capitalist, or where this is basic political economy, where does the capitalist make his profit? Well, obviously at the end of it, he's got to pay for all that. So that A, which is 100, he's got to pay that 100 out of that 200. So then he has to go to B. That's where he makes his profit from. So in fact, he gives 50 to the worker and 50 for himself. So I'll put L and C. L meaning labour and C meaning capital. So he takes that 50 for himself or herself. And that's profit. That's his profit or surplus value. That's where he has it. When they're talking about minimum wage, keeping wages down because they need to excite that profit even more. So for example, The company's made $500 million last financial year, and they've had a big celebration about it. But this financial year, they have to make a bigger profit. This is what capitalism does. So 750 million. So that 50 the workers given will be reduced next year down, say, to 30. And the employer will take 70 of it, etc., etc. That way they increase it. So that's where they make their profit. What was also interesting in this article as well, when they're saying high wages brings up the cost of everything. I'll repeat that. When the bourgeois economists say with higher wages can bring up the cost of everything, your products and your services, etc. That is a myth. That is a complete myth. I'll tell you why. In here as well, I'll read this little paragraph. Who pays for the minimum wage? In theory, a high cost base could be passed on to consumers through higher prices or absorbed by employers through lower profit margins. In reality, the answer varies by market. In competitive sectors, such as fast food, research has found that a 10% increase in the wage floor pushes up burger prices by just, wait for this, just 0.09%. In 2019, a study of supermarkets in Seattle found no impact on grocery prices from big increases. That's why it's always been a myth. But when a company or several group of companies, an employer federation, etc., turns around and says, well, your increase was going to cost us this, we cannot compete. And it's crap. What they're actually saying, they're digging into our profit margin. Now, in the case with wages and conditions, no one put the argument forward, well, why doesn't the capitalist reduce his profit margin instead? Why? Because we live in a capitalist system. For the capitalist to reduce his profit margin, he will then be pushed out of the game altogether. And another one will come along and to increase their profit. They have to do that. This is the system of capitalism, basic political economy of capitalism. And it's interesting that bourgeois economists are at least acknowledging some. And I've always said too something about a bourgeois economist. Bourgeois economists are the modern day witch doctors that practice alchemy. A lot of language and jargon. Once you start digging through all the language and jargon they use, like from derivatives to whatever, you get to the point is that this is what the basic things that's happening here. This is the underlying core. And what's produced doesn't cost any more. What happens though, if a worker is paid less and less and less, he or she is unable to buy what is produced. Then we have a crisis of overproduction because we have all this material abundance, all this new material wealth that has been produced. No one's able to afford it. I'll give you a classic example, the car industry. Now, back in 2014, it was quite a tragedy for Australia. There was a decision by Toyota, Ford, and General Motors to close down the car plants. And by the end of 2017, the last Ford rolled off the production line here in Australia. It was a sad time. Lots of people were out of work. And it was also geared on by a very conservative federal government at the time, Tony Abbott, who was also a nut job as well, very similar probably to Trump. Obviously, his government geared it on and dared the companies to close down. And they did. But they didn't do it because of that primary reason. There was a crisis of overproduction around the whole entire planet. They had to make decisions to what plants were closing. It happened in the UK, it happened in America, it happened here. New Zealand lost their automotive industry. I think many, many years ago. I was actually over there 22 years ago, and the last supply chain, manufacturing supply chain for the auto industry closed down in Auckland. That was their tyres, big rubber tyre manufacturing. This happened right around the world, not just the English-speaking countries as well. I want to just bottom it, but I'm using them as an example. But they had to make a decision what's going. Obviously, they looked at Australia, not a very strong domestic market for them. I mean, the size of Australia's population, I think we're lucky to be about the same population as California, maybe less, 25 million, in fact. So they're looking at, this is what the capitalists do. So they made a boardroom executive decision. Finally, okay, fine. We're closing the Australian plants down. Mind you, they were also heavily subsidised, but the idea was so they can modernise and retool. I was also a little bit critical about some of the subsidies because I did believe those companies did pocket a lot of that money too. It was paid by the taxpayers. But that was a systematic crisis around the world. Yes, they're manufacturing Holden cars in Thailand, not China, but Thailand. A lot of the four-wheel drives that Holden manufacture, or General Motors, Holden manufacturing come from Thailand. And I guess they're obviously looking for cheaper sources of labour. Why? Profit. Profit first, profit primary. That is the driving game. They're not in the business of making cars. They're in the business of making profit. Any capitalist enterprise, that's what they do, is they're in it to make profit. Not there to make a car, not because they enjoy doing it. They probably are car enthusiasts. Or someone's into food production. Example, making tin fruit, pickled vegetables, etc. And they may enjoy pickling vegetables. But no, they're not in it for that. They're in it to make a profit. And that's what we're seeing around the world. Australia is no exception to the rule on this. And why now the attack on wages and conditions? It's been going for some time now. Let's not make it. It just didn't happen overnight. And it just did happen because of COVID-19. This has been on the agenda for quite some time. And that's why we do it. We live in a capitalist society. What we gain now will always be taken back from us. And this is why, following up from my first video about why it's important to be active in trade unions, we do need to be organised. We do need to be organised thoroughly through trade unions. That's first and primary. We also need to be organised through worker cooperatives. And I'd like to take my hats off and acknowledge Earthworker here as well. They do an exceptional job in leading the way. It's certainly a difficult task about leading up worker cooperatives. Vitally important. And I just want to give you a little bit of information. Actually, the union I'm in, I'm an organiser for in Victoria, the AMWU, we actually have a policy. If a factory closes down for whatever reason, wants to move offshore, cheaper sources of labour, or just closing down, etc., well, those workers have the right to take it over. Now the question is, how are we going to put that into practice moving forward? Moving forward. And that's where the question is. That's why it's vitally important. I wanted to follow up on that as well. There's also another point I need to follow up as well. I did bring up about you need to be a member of the union that's got the jurisdictional coverage of your classification. Why? Because if you do need legal representation, they will look at the union rules of who you can cover and who you can't. So you have to be in a metal or mechanical trade such as I am. My trade background is a boilermaker. You do need to be in the AMWU. If you happen to be a painter and decorator, plasterer, gyprock, bricklayer, carpenter, you need to be in the CFMU, construction division, etc. You have to be an office clerk doing administration. Well, then obviously ASU. Just three classic examples of that. We do need to be. That's why it's vitally important to be involved in the union that's got the jurisdictional coverage and to build that organisation on the ground up. It's certainly a difficult task, but that's why I needed the importance of it. And I did rely on the importance about being COVID because there is a lot of hostile employers out there. Some of them might be the most pleasant people you can speak to straight away, but next thing you know, if you've been tapped on the shoulder, your services are no longer required. It's not because your services are no longer required, because they know full well you've been active trying to organise their workplace. Because employers, the capitalists themselves, are scared of organised labour. They always have been and always will be while they're still in existence. If they have organised labour, and this is where I'm talking about where we move from lower to higher levels of struggle, workers will gain that consciousness through their experience in struggle that it's the system itself that needs to go. And they know this. They do know this. The whole bourgeoisie around the world know this. That's why they throw everything at to try and discredit Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, all of it, and even Maduro. That's what they try and do because they know the capitalist system is so on the nose. They know it can no longer provide the basic needs for us anymore. The basic needs that Marx actually pointed out: clothing, food, shelter, water, education, health, electricity, utilities, etc. It is now unable. It is at that rotten stage where it's decaying and destroying its very own institutions. And that's why it's vitally important that socialists and communists are back again organising in unions again. And important, generating that climate, that community of solidarity, working class consciousness. People have talked about the decline of unionism. Let's talk about the decline of working class consciousness for a minute. So there's a lot of workers do not identify as working class, even though they are. They identify them as their nationality. And that's why we need to get back in there and get back into it. As Caleb Morpin correctly said, get out of the movement and get back into the masses. This is where we need to be back in again. Doing the hard yards. That means even on a Saturday afternoon is setting up a little card table in a shopping centre with 2 chairs, handing out some flyers and talking to people. And when this COVID-19's over, going around door knocking, having that discussion, being involved in all sorts of community groups, etc. We do need to go back. We don't need to create anything new. Lenin even said that. We don't need to create something new. We need to go where the struggle is at and find that and find where it's at and be involved there. Not sit on the side and throw criticism. And also, I'm a little bit annoyed at those comrades that come up and criticise. They open a book of Lenin and go, well, this is what he said, and they're not involved in anything. That's got to stop. No more armchair activism. No more keyboard activism. Get out there and start doing the hard yards. It's not easy. I profess that. It is not easy. But I do it every day. I'm fortunate to be in a position I can do it anyway. But we do need to. Don't expect miracles to happen overnight. But this is where we need to be at. That's why a little rant on that one. But it's important to understand the basics of political economy. Marx went a lot more detail in Capital. Interesting. He started off on what was a commodity and commodity was, and explained it was a product that was something that was made for exchange, basic form of commodity production and commodity exchange. It's certainly extensive read. I believe Matt Cedillo is, and along with another comrade of his, doing a lot of talks on Capital at the moment. Just beware, I might drop out here too. It says your connection is unstable. Please wait while we try and reconnect you. Bugger. I'm back on. I just dropped out there. So look, it's a comrade that actually is reading comrade Matt Cedillo in the US, along with another fellow comrade of his, doing some excellent live chats on Marx's Capital. I suggest you start with video 1 and read through it, and it'll help you guide that. It's quite an extensive read and it's quite challenging, but I can take my hats off to those 2 comrades that are reading it. That's actually called The Poet and the Professor. I also want to talk a little bit more about class struggle here in Australia, what's going on as well. I think she was all interested for our international comrades. A big shout out to all those in the US and the UK and Europe as well. The comrades in the CPGBMLs and the Workers' Party of Britain, you're doing an exceptional job, and I highly recommend going to the Workers' Party Facebook page, but YouTube channel. Comrade Ranjit Borough is doing some excellent work on how the working class came into being, and also on political economy as well. Some excellent stuff there. And Caleb Morpin starting in 10:30, just over an hour's time as well. And I recommend logging onto his channels, and also Comrade Dusk James, who we've just finished reading this, studying this, The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. I highly recommend reading this. If you want an introduction to Marxism, here it is. Simple, easy understood. It's a fascinating history, but it shows you matter in motion. And that's what it is. It shows you how things are in motion from lower to higher forms of struggle, which I just touched on before. Now we're going to talk about class struggle here. And I'll just be talking about wages and conditions and some basic political economy. And obviously the class struggle is really going to intensify, especially after we get through this whole COVID-19 episode. And I think prime at the moment, we need to get through this as much as possible and beat this virus. But I want to actually quote this. I assume everyone's read this. Classic piece of work. And I love this opening line to chapter 1. That's the preface. Bear with me a minute, comrades. And I'll also put my glasses on. And I'll have a sip of this water. Under bourgeois and proletarians, and I love this first line. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Wow. Now, the document says that. First document on this planet that said that anywhere. It is the history of class struggles, and it really applies to here in Australia as well. The history of Australian society is the history of class struggle here, of organised labour from the outside, from the early convict years of when they were penal colonies, when the convicts even organised themselves through battles such as the Battle of Vinegar Hill, which happened out of a suburb near Rouse Hill in Sydney there, actually where the big Rouse Hill Cemetery is. It's where it happened between Irish convicts and British authorities at the time. History of the Indigenous resistance as well. And before I proceed further too, I do apologise. I should acknowledge them. Also acknowledge that I'm actually speaking on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung here in central Victoria. Pay my respect to the elders past, present and future. And also add on further that their struggle is our struggle. We are fighting the same forces together. They are part of us, the working class as well. And I'd like to actually extend that out to our Indigenous brothers and sisters in this. It's certainly their struggle. They've been in since 1788. They've got a lot of discrimination and right through their whole society. But going back to it, that their struggle is part of ours, the class struggle itself. It is, and as I said, it's the history of organised labour from the early convicts, the Indigenous resistance, right through to Eureka, the Goldfields rebellions, right through to modern day trade unionism. And what's interesting, we're now on the 167th anniversary of the Red Ribbon Rebellion here in Bendigo. And I'll talk about the early class struggle, especially on the central goldfields here in Victoria. The rebellion didn't start here in Bendigo, nor did it start at Eureka either. It actually started earlier on in 1851 in Chewton, just south of Castlemaine. They're known as Chowtown. And they've Fisher's Creek, I think it is, or Forest Creek. That's where the site was of a big monster meeting. And obviously at that time, the Governor Latrobe, there was a colonial authorities wanted to impose a gold tax. You're on the Victorian goldfields, you had to pay gold tax if you're mining it. Now, it's not a matter if they wanted to pay tax, it was how it was implemented and how it was enforced. It was through a very brutal regime. If you couldn't show your licence, even if you paid an extraordinary amount for it, or your tax, you showed you paid your gold fee or your gold tax, you're arrested in stock and change, flogged, dragged by horse, etc. It was a real brutal regime. I understand there was also a labour shortage at the time, so they needed to do something. There was a way of going about it. But no one had a say in paying tax. But how it was enforced and how corruptly it was enforced as well. A lot of cases where people mining for gold, they were panning for gold, had to pay twice. Not only pay the tax, but pay the local trooper or the early forms of police. Yes, that happened. It didn't happen. It wasn't done that the police were completely honest. A lot of them were ratbags and scoundrels. Funny enough, that's quite an old history. I won't go into the whole history about the police force, especially the New South Wales Rum Corps, the early 1800s. But certainly that's one big issue on its own. However, this is what happened. So there was a big monster meeting called on the 14th of December 1851, and in Chewton. And at the time, it wasn't just like a few thousand, it wasn't a few hundred, tens of thousands. I mean, possibly 15 to 20,000 people turned up to it and agreed not to pay any tax. At the time, Governor Latrobe waived it, so it was a temporary reprieve. 2 years later, Bendigo, August 27th was the final culmination of it, but it actually started on the 21st of August, was the Red Ribbon Rebellion. It was a brutal regime of imposing a tax. And finally, after several meetings around the vicinity of Bendigo, which was pretty much around the hills, the big hill just overlooking the city itself, or just up from there, there was obviously meetings called the miners, etc. And we've agreed to not to pay the tax again. And there was petitions actually signed. There's still the governor of the time, Governor Latrobe, tried to ignore it. Actually, that big petition was over 30,000 signatures to it. We believe it's locked in a vault somewhere in Melbourne, and no one's able to access it. It'd be quite interesting to see who was signature to it at the time. It was we had our, and we Zunga Rise were called Red Ribbon Rebellion because everyone wore a red ribbon, either in the hat, on their arm, or on the front of the shirt. Red, the symbol of freedom, the symbol of the blood of the worker. And we had our own distinct flag as well. It was a red flag, funny enough, and it had 4 symbols on it. It had the scales for justice, the miner's cradle and the miner's pick and shovel for representing our labour, a bundle of sticks. Not the fasci, don't be ever confused it with the Roman Legion and the fasci, but it was a bundle of sticks. It was an early Union symbol. One stick bends or breaks, but a whole bunch is strong. So it represented our solidarity, our unity, and the kangaroo and emu, which represent not a step back, but a step forward. And we're next week, and I want to announce this, next week on Facebook, like the Bendigo Trades Hall page, Bendigo Trades Hall Council page, that's our peak union body here in Bendigo. Luke Martin, the secretary, is actually a good friend of mine. He will be doing the talk on that and explain the story and tell the story. It's at 6 o'clock our time, Australian Eastern Standard Time. So note that down. I'm asking everyone to please share that far and wide, like it, and learn a lot more about our rebellion. Obviously, at that time, back in 1853, it could have ended in bloodshed, but didn't. But people were fully armed. There was not a single lead found anywhere in the Bendigo region. It was all made into musket ball at the time, ready to be organised. But the brilliant organisation of that was it didn't lead to bloodshed. Unfortunately, it did the following year on 3rd of December in 1854, culminated in Eureka. By then, it was Governor Hotham, who is now the colonial governor. He had second thoughts about brutally crushing any form of rebellion. And it wasn't about, people weren't opposed to paying the tax, but it went under the old US fight for the independence banner. No taxation without representation. Because at that time, out of that struggle, people like yourself, myself, anyone else couldn't vote. Not unless you're landed gentry, or you're a complete toff, military brass, or you're completely rich. That's it. But the rest of us, common folk, couldn't do it. We weren't allowed to vote. We had early colonial governments, we weren't allowed to vote. But through that rebellion, we managed to get some form of suffrage. First of all, male suffrage, women's suffrage came on late at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Certainly the struggle continued there to have them to vote as well, but it was a start. You can be a worker, you can be rent, subway, etc., but you're able to vote. That was an important thing. So there were certain reforms that had to be given, because obviously there was agitation on the New South Wales goldfields around Bathurst, Safari, Hill End, etc. It was starting to spread. And what the British authorities thought at the time, this is after crushing the diggers at Eureka, Stockade and Ballarat in 1854, they realised they've got a problem on their hand. This could have turned into a full rebellion of the eastern states of Australia, aka our War of Independence. It didn't eventuate that, and because a lot of concessions were given at the time. But it laid the foundation of a lot of our later struggles for the trade union movement through the 1800s, right through into the 1900s, well into the 20th century. Certainly a lot of unions to this day use the Eureka flag. I haven't got a copy with me at the moment, It's a blue flag with a white cross with 5 stars on it. And it certainly, if you wish to look it up, just Google it, just the Eureka flag, and you'll see it there. So that's, I just wanted to give you a sort of form of that. That was some of the early struggles, the foundations of our current struggle here. And it was only done through organised labour. Furthermore, all the democratic rights that we do enjoy, from voting, from participating in Parliament, not perfect, through to joining a weekend, being enjoyed about all sorts of things we do enjoy in life here in Australia. Actually, funny enough, it was all fought by organised labour in the respective unions later on. People say soldiers, we're just at the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And sure, that was a fight for our life back then. We were on the verge of being invaded by Imperial Japan, and obviously, yeah, victory in the Pacific. And then certainly those who went off to fort and died were mostly working class people. They realised it was also too, it was a good organisation by the Communist Party at the time. It was actually a united front against fascism, and we needed to do our part at that time to defeat that, and which we did. I won't go over Crimea and Interception, but all the other wars we fought in wasn't about freedom. No. It wasn't about if we could speak English or not. No. It was all about profit. That was basically primarily for World War One, Boer War, World War One, right through to the wars leading after World War Two, the Malayan conflict, Vietnam, Korea, etc. And even obviously modern day Iraq as well, in Afghanistan. That was all about profit, and it wasn't about freedom. When they said, when you hear someone say, "Oh, but the talk about freedom, blah blah blah," no, wrong. Did not. Actually, a lot of those soldiers that came back from World War One became card-carrying communists, because they saw the horror, not just the horrors of war, they understood what it was all about at the end there. And Anzac Day originally, funny enough, the early ones was all about not just, it was actually remembering what that war was all about. Yes, not about trying to just remember those that have fallen, but it was actually a form of struggle against the authorities at the time and the bourgeoisie that were saying we don't want to do this again. So it was in fact, it was an actual form. But unfortunately, it's been distorted over the years. It's a very nationalistic thing, etc., 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 not realising, understanding what those early soldiers, returned soldiers, were talking about. When I say the history of class struggle in Australia here, it's actually this is what made our modern society. Now, I was actually talking a little bit about wages and conditions for you. What determines wages and conditions? What determines wages and conditions? It is the relative strength between two classes, labour and capital. In the 1970s, the 60s and 70s, the working class was in a strong position to go for a lot of positions. But a lot of positions, what I'm saying, a lot of conditions. Unions were strong, I believe up to about 75 to 80% of the workforce that covered. That was bad. It peaked in 1969 with the breaking of the penal codes against unions and trade unions all over, with Jolyon Clary-O'Shea, who was the secretary of the Tramways Union, and made those laws redundant. And throughout the 70s, the bourgeoisie dared not take on organised labour. And that's why we were able to make some great improvements during that time. Because the working class was in a position of strength, not in a position of weakness. The bourgeoisie realised this, and they liked, as I said, they liked to discredit Marx and Engels. But they know for a fact that they are on the nose, and they know full well what they need to do. They've read Capital. They do read Capital, interesting enough. They do read communist literature or Marxist literature. They do know it. They know that for a fact, so they're doing everything possible. But in that time, what do? It had to be a gradual weakening of the working class through it. Now, people said the weakening of the working class and everything happened when Bob Hawke and Paul Keating won the government, a Labor government back in the early 80s, and we had the Accord. Well, actually, let's take back a little bit of time, a few more years before that. It was when, during the coup against the CIA-backed coup against the Whitlam government, and Fraser was elected in, or not elected, but he was certainly imposed on us through Governor John Kerr. And shortly a year after, or that following year, there was an election which ratified his position. There was a piece of legislation that came in, I think about 1976, that came in. It was called the Trade Practices Act, 1977 it was. Sections E and D. That stopped secondary boycotts, stopped unions from secondary boycotting, which was, if they did pursue down that path, would have been paying heavy fines again. Yes? That's where pretty much you can look at where it started. But what was happening around the world at the time as well. So it wasn't just internally. Australia is not an exception. We've got to look at what the internal and external. Externally around the world, early 1970s, there was a major coup in Chile against the Allende government. Pinochet came to power. The first ever experiment anywhere. And it wasn't just, it was brute force fascism that came into being. And it wasn't about building an economy. Under Pinochet, everything was destroyed. Not only people were murdered, but all industries were privatised. This was the Milton Friedman, Chicago 5 School of Economics neoliberalism that was imposed. It was the first country you could see that happen. This was the turning point. You had governments from all around the world agreeing the first rounds of free trade agreements were called the Lima Agreements. This was to allow capitalism then to start having unfettered rule right through the whole entire planet. Without, they could bypass government legislation, etc. Well, the first forms that were happening around that time. So what that piece of legislation I told you about was just a reflection of what was happening around. And they needed, for Australia, they needed to weaken the working class. And through that time, there was class struggle didn't stop. It certainly escalated in the late 70s through to early 80s. And we actually achieved some really good things, the 38-hour week. Some places, the 35-hour week. No loss in pay either. We have a rostered day off once a month in those unionised places. Some places now have two, because in construction, they have a 36-hour week. Just those little basics to enjoy, and then a few other things and good improvements. Became Bob Hawke, Labor Prime Minister at the time. Promised a lot. In short, we got superannuation, we got Medicare. It was improved, although not very good, mind you, but it covered a lot of the basics of our medical, for a lot of our medical expenses. But we had a thing called the Accord. Now, the idea was the Accord was a social contract. Because if unions, workers can actually show wage restraint and trade off, we can get all these great things. Well, a lot of great things did not eventuate either. Capital went on the offensive, big time. And through that period, some unions didn't agree to it. We had the deregistration of the Builders Labourers Federation that actually totally opposed that. They might have signed on to it originally, but they actually went on a campaign. They saw right through it, and it was just basic collaboration, selling the work, and they saw what happened there. It was a dark time for unionism in this country. The real original idea of the Accord was so we can actually go similar to the Swedish or Norwegian model, that we can gain some certain social conditions, a social wage, etc., free health, free education, etc., etc., etc. If we managed to have some restraint in our wages. But that obviously didn't happen. In fact, the reverse happened. The attack on the working class was astronomical. So we've lost the Builders Labourers Federation. The pilots dispute of 1989, they were smashed. Bob Hawke brought the military in for that, the Air Force. Yes. Where the dollar sweets dispute, which actually in 1986, I believe that happened, that was actually one of our predecessor unions, the food preservers or food confectionery workers. They got brutally fined big time for their strikes, etc. The year before, 1985, we had the Mudgeonberry dispute, which was the meat workers, and they were fined and they were crippled completely. So you could see right through that period, there was actually a continual attack. And also a very important, I believe, was ground zero. It was the Robe River dispute in the Pilbara. A very close friend and comrade of mine, Graham Haynes, I'd like to acknowledge him as well. Brilliant person. He was the ETU co-convener up at Cape Lambert at the time, Wickham. For those of you not familiar with Australia, have a look. The Pilbara It's up there, but a famous dispute. It was a highly unionised workforce. It took at least 2 or 3 years for the parent company, Pico Wallsend, who took on the workers there and we smashed the unions. And it was a mixture of class collaboration by certain individuals in the union movement, say senior union officials, and I'll admit that now. Unfortunately, that happened, and no proper working class unity behind them to support them. And you could see then too, it was the systematic start of the deunionisation of the iron ore sector in the Pilbara, which escalated at the end of about the year 2000 with BHP taking on the workforce with and implementing individual contracts. So there wasn't an overnight thing to where we are now. This was a gradual attack through the 1980s through to the early 90s. What happened in about late 1980s and early 90s around the world? The big worldwide recession. And what a bad time it could happen for working class people, masses of unemployed. So it put the working class into a greater weakened situation. What else happened in the 1990s? We also lost a lot of manufacturing, went offshore, closed down altogether. Right? The trucks used to come in, the right announcement, factory closure, redundancies. Next thing you know, next day they're bringing trucks in, load all the equipment up on trucks, send it off to port, exit overseas. And I will say this, so let's be all fair about this. Everyone goes about China, this and China. China did not march in here and take our jobs, for starters. Yes, there was a lot of agreements. And interesting, though, it wasn't so long ago I spoke with a Chinese national about manufacturing and what happened, and he was gobsmacked. He goes, why did you people allow this all to happen in the first place? And that's a very good question. So we wouldn't have allowed this to happen. And this guy was a supporter of the CPC, Chinese Communist Party. And on top of that as well, he says, we actually arrested those people that would organise things like that. Yeah. So what did we do? And I think in Australia here, us workers need to put our anger towards our bourgeoisie. Not our bourgeois, but the bourgeoisie here, the capitalists here, the multinationals, the respected governments who allowed this to sit back and allow this all to happen in the name of free trade. Free trade for whom as well? Just remember that, free trade for whom? For which class? Keep that in mind. So we saw a lot of that. I actually saw it around my first hand as well. So it was in a bad time. Came in the early 2000s. Manufacturing was still declining, and then tax was still on the working class, was still ramping up even more. And it culminated by 2007, we campaigned and removed a Conservative government, and also the legislation that went around that. Fortunately, we were given when the Labor government was revoted back in 2007, 2008, we were given an act called the Fair Work Act. We use that to the day. Mind you, there's still a lot of penal provisions towards workers who take industrial action. Yes. So if workers want to withdraw their labour anytime, it can be faces a huge amount of fines. The only time they can withdraw their labour is what we call protected action. That's if good faith bargaining comes to an end, we couldn't move anymore, then we can apply to the what we call the Fair Work Commission for a ballot. That's if the Fair Work Commission approves it too. If we've ticked all the boxes, we've tried a good faith bargain, and then if the ballot is voted, a secret ballot voted up to take off whatever protected action that way, and only lasts for 30 days. That's put the working class in a lot of restraints. Now, why would they do that even when the working class was in a weakened position? Because they're afraid they know full well the workers can and will do it one day again to fight back. Now, under this is how we're going to organise again. And this is what, from my first talk I did on this live stream, this is why we need to be very important that we are involved in working class people every day, in unions, exceptionally unions, but in the community as well. So that sort of wraps that up, why we need to get back in there and do that organising. We've got a lot of work to do here in Australia. Our work is not isolated or separate from the rest of the world. The attack on the working class around the world is phenomenal. So we are part of an international struggle against imperialism, against capitalism. We are part of an international struggle for socialism as well. It's nothing separate, nothing's independent of each other. We are in that struggle all of us together. And we do need to show how we can enhance that and advance that international struggle more. And I think a good starting point we could do for all us around the world. Well, let's look at particular companies. I'm just going to use Rio Tinto. I don't like Rio Tinto for obvious reasons. I'm not going to get into it. But say if we say if there was a dispute in South Africa, the miners there are in dispute. Why can't we do actions against Rio Tinto here? Okay, might not immediately withdraw our labour, but we can do other things as well. Yes, that's part of internationalism. That's international struggle. Internationalism is not, and I know, and I'm not going to name the person or the people that do this. It's not about having mans out for money because against it and so-called raising money so they can get onto a jet and fly around the world, be at all these particular conferences of anti-imperialism. That and look, we're here. Whoa, they're there. You know, and that's not internationalism and taking all the glory on other people's work. That's not international struggle. It's what we do on the ground here. It's vitally important. It's international struggle. Sure, we've got particular conditions, the material conditions determine how we're going to struggle under that particular arrangement, but that's what we need to do. And moving forward, that's why I'm great doing these live feeds and communicating with people around the world. One thing about COVID-19, just on this, it's been one thing that's a blessing in disguise is we've actually been able to communicate at a worldwide level. I just thought last few years, why weren't we doing this before? But it's put us now, forced us to do so. And so we can start sharing ideas and listen to other people's concerns and problems and think, okay, maybe we can do something different here, or maybe you want to try something, do something different there and learn from us. I'm not going to tell you how to do it, obviously, learn from that. But I want to sum that up. That's why it's important we can go moving forward. So I just touched on it. Next, I just want to, there'll be a lot more of these live feeds. I'll be talking about the class struggle here in Australia. There's certainly a lot of things happening, and it's just, I could be here forever and a day, all day, boring as to death. No, that's not going to work. I want to keep these to about an hour videos at the most. But it's important that we keep that up, that international solidarity in what we do here as well. Just on more other contemporary issues as well. I know I made a little bit of a criticism about what happened with Belarus, everything else. I guess that was, I was partly a bit wrong, really, on some of my criticisms. I came out of concerns because I've seen what happened, right, with Eastern Europe. I've seen what happened with Libya and everywhere else, these so-called coloured revolutions, etc. And that's what it was. And I'm going to recommend reading this book. Currently I'm reading another book at the moment. I can't read 10 dozen things at the same time, but I recommend this, The Last Soviet Republic. And it's Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus. But I was talking to someone on Zoom the other day. I want to just read this. Got my glasses on. I'll sip of water first. A brief history of early Belarus. Belarus, with its clean lakes, natural forests, and unplundered natural economy, is attracting avid interest from all sides. Andrei Lukashenko. Keep that in mind. Where is Belarus? This question is one I have been asked by many people as I have begun researching this book. Compared to other nations of the former Russian Empire and Soviet Union, such as Finland, the Baltic states, Kazakhstan, or Ukraine, Belarus is certainly unfamiliar to most in the West. Belarus is a landlocked country that lies between Poland and Russia. It is comparable in size to England and Scotland combined, or to the US state of Kansas. Belarus occupies a strategic geographic position in Europe and historically has served as the gateway to invasions of Russia from the west and to Europe from the east. That was a concern. That was the gateway, because obviously there are imperial or CIA and NATO-backed agents in that country causing disruption. We acknowledge that. And what we understand, if the imperialists get their way with Belarus, you can just imagine what the threat that was going to be with Russia. Fortunately, I do believe Lukashenko can turn things around, or it's just this is what happened. So that was the reason why when I read that, oh, this is a big concern here as well. Fortunately, now Putin, I believe actually Putin and Lukashenko's made up, and it's good to see that Russia's prepared to give them military assistance, but without this condition, he needs to get some things sorted within his own country. If you want sources on Belarus, I would recommend current media outlets such as RT, Press TV, China Global Television Network, etc. Not our mainstream media, and let's face it, our mainstream media lies, including the ABC and SBS. They only give one particular view of it. They actually don't know. Most of the times, a lot of these people would care less about Belarus, but obviously be careful where we source our information as well. So I do apologise a little bit. I was a bit harsh in my criticism, but I was out of concerns. I've seen this happen before. I thought, oh no, here we go again. So that's really important as well. I hope I provided some assistance today and talk a little bit more. I will be doing a lot of these live chats weekly. Obviously around about for an hour. I don't want to bore people too long. And there's a couple of other books. I'm currently reading this at the moment. I did mention China before. Now, I will do a talk a little bit more about it, but I highly recommend it. If you want to know about modern day China, Xi Jinping, the governance of China Squad. It's actually quite an easy read. It looks like a thick book, but it's an easy read. It's actually written well, and it gives me a lot more understanding of what's going on in there as well. And instead of, I know it's been hard, and look, we should call China out sometimes when things do happen overseas. I believe Jason Unruh made a criticism of what they did in Somalia. I forget the other country as well. And we should call that out. But there's a way of going about doing these things as well. I don't think look, we got to understand as well, the class struggle is worldwide. There's struggle in China as well. Let's face it, it's not perfect. Yes, there's capitalist modes of production in China. Let's face it. I mean, obviously reading this actually only clarifies something. There is a big class struggle in the country as well. But it's also too, I believe actually, and I could be premature on saying this, but I believe actually the working class is starting to become a little bit more advanced and again lift more people out of poverty and etc. So let's just watch this space, what happens. The other one as well, I would recommend, or highly recommended books to read about contemporary affairs, is this brilliant one, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age by Caleb Maupin. I've read this. Actually, I ordered 2 more copies, donated to the Bendigo Trades Hall Council Library Institute, one there, and also to our local Bendigo Library, known as the Goldfields Library. So this is something a brilliant read, comrades. Read this; it's fantastic. And obviously, when I was one of our educationals, one of the 3 internationals I did with Dust James 2 weeks ago, we talked about fascism. If you want to know what fascism is, and once again, I'll repeat this again, understand what it is. Don't just use the word lightly. I just saw a comrade write on Facebook. I'm not going to mention names. I'm not into it. And maybe just because he might have had a reaction, I don't know. But he made a comment about compulsory vaccinations against COVID, and then put a picture of Auschwitz on the page saying, oh, you know, blah, blah, blah. Stop comparing. You're comparing it. Don't use that loosely, please. No. We're trying to beat a COVID-19 here. We're not trying to escalate now. Understand, but I would highly recommend to understand that Against Fascism and War by Georgy Dimitrov, and explain what fascism really is. Fascism is not separate from capitalism. It's not a separate social system. It is brute terror capitalism, finance capital, and that's what we need to understand what it is. And unfortunately, you know, look, people don't do it deliberately. I think they probably do it subconsciously. They just use it in a very loose term, not understanding what it is. Yeah, we've got a few more minutes to go, but I want to read this off as well. And I think this is also another great book I will want to talk about. Why Communism by Marseille Olgan, and American and Communist. And I love the simple literature, everything else. And I think that's beautiful as well about some of the stuff I've been reading in. And it's just how simple, easily put, it's easily understood. And some good books I've just showed you, what an introduction to Marxism, the history of the 3 international, highly recommended. If you want to understand about fascism, Georgy Dimitrov. Other ones are into Marxism, back to what's in this book. Anything on about China, Xi Jinping. Some of these things are quite, and this is great. You don't have to read some advanced, really hard read, but it's quite straightforward. Look, it's a few minutes to go. Caleb Maupin's going to be on at 10:30 our time, Australian Eastern Standard Time. I've got to believe that'd be 8:30 in Perth, and obviously 8:30 in the evening back in New York. But I want to finish off with this little booklet. I read it to some comrades the other day. Another sip of this water. Now, the melody. You are a worker. You have had a job for a number of years. Your pay was not high, but you managed to get along. You were a faithful worker. You never shirked. Perhaps you saved up a few dollars against a rainy day. Perhaps you married and raised a family. You were decent, law-abiding. One nice morning, you are told your services are no longer needed. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In plain words, you are fired. You are thrown out. There is a depression, they say. The employer has no more work for you. He cuts operations or he shuts his plant altogether. While you remain without a livelihood, he goes to his country estate or abroad to have a good time. He does not care to think what will happen to you. You plainly do not exist for the company any longer. It has no obligations towards its unemployed. And yet, come to think of it, you are not a stranger to this factory or mill or shop. You and the like of you have built it. You and the like of you have created all the machinery, all the raw material, and all the fuel which is necessary to run an industry. You and the like of you are the live power that puts motion into the dead matter of every industrial undertaking. It is your blood, your sweat, your muscle, and your brain that is sunk into every piece of goods produced. You have much at stake in this establishment, your whole life. It is yours, more than the owner's. It is part of your very self. Suppose now, when you are told to go, you refuse to budge. Suppose many of you get together and say that you are going to stay where you belong and continue working because this is the only source of your livelihood. Suppose you say you are going to reduce the benefit of yourself and others. This thought may be strange to you. I'll repeat that. I'd like to repeat that. Suppose you say you are going to produce for the benefit of yourself and others. This thought may be strange to you, yet consider what would happen. The owner, who has never worked and who does not know how to work, would call the police. Most probably the riot squad would appear. Perhaps the militia would be called out. There would be clubs and riot guns and tear gas bombs galore. You would be clubbed and shot and many of you imprisoned, tried and convicted for the sole crime of wanting to continue working at the machines and with the materials you and the like of you have produced. Has it ever occurred to you that such of a state of affairs is wrong? I'll repeat that question. Has it ever occurred to you that such a state of affairs is wrong? Folks, that's this great book, Why Communism? And that's the system we do live under currently at the moment. I think that's what that question we should all ask ourselves and everybody. Has it ever occurred to us the whole state of affairs and the system we live under is wrong? People, it's been good to speak to you. I'm going to try and do another one next Saturday morning, our time, 9 o'clock our time. All the best from Bendigo, all the best for the week. Keep up the struggle, dare to win. If you don't fight, you lose. Thank you.